So what we have here is a 1997 Husqvarna 41 chainsaw, and this saw had been sitting for about a year, and I went to go start it to do some Christmas tree cutting, and couldn't even pull on the pull cord. It was jammed. So I'd never run into something like that before, so ended up taking the whole saw apart all the way down to the cylinder to figure out what was going on. And once I had it apart, I realized I should do a video of it to, I guess, document it. So this is so I started videoing it as I was putting it back together and kind of doing a whole disassembly and reassembly process. Long story short, it was varnish on my cylinder, on my piston. It was making the piston stick to the cylinder wall. That was keeping me from turning the saw over. So that's a lesson that I need to do a better job about making sure the fuel is drained and empty. Run the saw dry before I store it for a long period of time. I think that would be a wise thing to do. Also, acetone and I think carburetor cleaner both did a really good job of cleaning the varnish off. So if I ever run into something like that again, I'm going to spray some of that down into the cylinder to try to get it to loosen up before I try digging all the way into the saw again, or any other piece of equipment that something similar happens to. It was I guess I was afraid that I had somehow run the saw lean and or not mixed oil or something, which would have been really dumb for me to do. And I had seized the piston to the cylinder that way. That was my worst fear, so that's why I decided to tear all the way into it. I actually did let the cylinder sit with some Marvel Mystery Oil for about a week before deciding to fully tear into it, and it didn't budge it. I should have just tried a different fluid, and it might have ended up freeing it up and making it work okay. But still wanted to get it, I guess at the end of the day, I wanted to get it in there to see what was going on, just so that I could be sure that to expect some good useful life out of this saw after all. So with that, this little video is about disassembling and reassembling a Husqvarna 41. I'm not a mechanic, but I do pretend to be one on the weekends sometimes, and so this video is probably going to have several mistakes or things that I say that are dumb, so use at your own risk. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is take the bar off and the chain. Just makes it a little easier to move around the workbench and doesn't hit as many things along the way. So take your scrunch, loosen the bar nuts. Should be pretty self-explanatory for most saw owners. Okay, and then the chain brake cover comes off. Clean this one up already. Chain tensioner right here. To make sure this little pawl lines up with the hole in the bar when you put it back together, because that's what tensions the bar. And you can push it in. Chain kind of comes off. So, get this bar out of the way. chain comes off. So now you can get to your clutch, you can get to anything you need on this side of the chainsaw. Alright, so first thing we got to start doing on this side of the saw is to start taking the covers off. So the scrunch actually works pretty good for taking this top cover off. It's just the blade is just the right kind of size to get these bolts off of here. So we'll do that real quick. And then one back on this side. And off that pops. It's reasonably clean under there, so that's good. And then the recoil, can use a scrunch as well to get that off. I guess they do that because you might be taking this off in the field. Now the recoil assembly, you got to be a little careful because there's two different types of fasteners used on it. Two of these thread into plastic and have coarse threads, and the other two thread into a metal thread. It's part of what holds the two halves of the saw together, the handle and the saw case. So you just have to keep them straight once you get this thing taken off. You don't want to try threading the wrong fastener into the wrong hole. So just keep them in their own holes and everything will be fine. And then we have our air injection cover plate here. Just sits in there, keeps this little guy in the right spot so it doesn't hit the flywheel. We want to make sure we don't mess with that. Now, sometimes when you can't pull the pull cord, sometimes it's because the pull cord's seized. So you want to just do a little test, make sure you can pull it and it recoils just like it's supposed to. This thing works fine. So it's something deeper, and when I had first pulled this apart, I couldn't turn the flywheel at all. And it is supposed to turn by hand with reasonable effort if everything's working fine and nothing's jammed up. And there's the underside of the pull cord, so if you break the pull cord you'll have to kind of re-thread this thing and re-lock it down with that little lock bolt in order to get it. And just kind of make sure all the teeth on this are in good enough shape, it's not going to start slipping on you. Well, time to get the air filter off and start digging into the interior of this saw, some of the internals. We got to get all the intake components off of here, and so the air filter is pretty easy. You got to do this periodically anyways it's part of your tune-up procedure. So just a flathead screwdriver will take the two air filter bolts out. And off it comes. Alright, next step to access the inside of the saw is to take off this little air filter adapter plate. So it's just a 10mm wrench. Take off these two bolts that hold it on, and shouldn't unthread the whole stud that's behind that, but if it does then you can just pull it out and kind of get it fixed later. And then it just slides off. So now, to get the carburetor out takes a couple different things. We gotta loosen these studs here and here, but then underneath here there's this plate. We gotta loosen those two screws and get that plate out of the way first. So that's what I'm gonna do. Maybe start with this screws for this plate, get them out of the way. And the screw on this side by the switch holds down a couple of wire ring connectors, so we'll have to make sure to capture those when we put this back together. And these studs have a 7mm nut on them that helps used for taking them out, I guess. And we can lift the throttle lever a little bit to get to this one here. A lot of stuff's going to happen here. We got these studs. We have this plate that needs to come out. And then the carburetor, we have to undo the fuel line. Get that out of the way. And then the carburetor is going to come out, and the throttle lever and the choke lever are actually going to come out with it. And this throttle lever is kind of easy to take off. Just has this little hole on the side. So I'll set that aside for later. Alright, so now we have this air injection mechanism. Can come off really any time. So I think I'll just take it off now. It basically consists of this little blue director, or I don't know what you want to call it. Takes the air off the flywheel and directs it into the air filter area, and it also comes with this little rubber seal around this adapter plate to keep dirt and stuff out of that same area. So kind of just have to start peeling it off. It actually is better if you start at this end and kind of peel it off, and then it all slides off this way. And you just kind of keep that all together. It's about time to start getting this handle off of here. It's going to start being in the way here pretty soon. So there's just 2 bolts on the bottom and 2 on the side to hold the handle on. So we'll just start loosening them up and start getting this thing off of here. And just give it a little tug and twist. It should come off pretty easily. Sure. There we go. That's it. Need to start thinking about separating the saw in half. We're going to have to do this anyways to get to the crankcase. get the saw apart. But might as well do it now. We have most of the bolts off anyways. Most of them come with the recoil assembly, or at least there's two of them on this side that hold the bottom handle part of the saw in the fuel tank to the rest of the saw. And on the other side, the two primary ones are held by this cover and by this little chain guard. So we'll start by taking those two pieces off. And this one's a Phillips screw. This little thing pops off. And then the chain guard is a 4mm wrench. And that comes off. And then we'll turn the saw around. And I think that's actually everything remaining that's even holding this on. So notice the fuel line's coming up through the hole in the casing, so we'll just pull this down, we'll rotate it down and pop the fuel line out, and then we'll actually just slide these apart. So now we got two pieces. Thought we could take the spark plug out and get a good view of what's going on inside the cylinder. You may have already done this by this point in your diagnostic process. Getting the spark plug out is pretty simple. Just use your scrunch, and this one's just hand tight anyways, but scrunch fits. Thread it off, take a look at it. This one is clean, slightly brown, maybe a little bit darker than it should be, but doesn't really indicate a lean running problem or anything of that sort. And the next thing we can get off is this adapter plate for the intake. So it's these two screws here and here. Hold that guy in place. And then there's a rubber boot that slips over the intake part of the casting of the cylinder. So you just kind of have to wiggle it off there and it'll slide off with a little bit of careful force. And this thing's going to try to get tied up with some of this electrical wiring by the switch. So I've unhooked the switch connector at this point and give this room to kind of move around. So we just kind of pull it out away from the cylinder, kind of give it a little wiggle and a twist, and off it comes. And then we have our rubber boot here that can go on either end. Kind of nice to have it here for reassembly. And then this wiring can slip out. You have to have it in place first before you put this all back together though. We can take off the muffler assembly. Actually probably one of the first things you can do if you're trying to troubleshoot something like a stuck piston like I had, because take the muffler off, you can look in the exhaust port and you can get a pretty decent view of the piston from there. And oftentimes that'll tell you if it's scored or something is not looking good there. So, and it's pretty easy to take this off. Just these two bolts here. So we have our 8mm socket, and those come out. And then this half pops off, and it has the muffler screen as part of it. So we'll put that aside, and then inside here is one more bolt. Again, 8mm, so you don't have to change any wrench sizes or anything. And it gets the other half of the can off. And then behind it is a little, I guess, heat shield. And then inside the port is this little guy here. So that'll fall out if you dump the thing over, but that goes in the exhaust port. So yeah, you can look inside there and spin the flywheel, see the piston go up and down if it's not seized like mine was, and you can kind of see what's going on there. Next thing that we're going to need to take off, it's kind of in the way, is the Magneto, or maybe it's a stator, I'm not quite sure. But this guy right here, spark plug lead, switch, wiring, and you start with these two socket head cap screws. On the side here. This lower one has a ground ring as well, so we got to make sure that goes back. We'll put it back together. And we pull the little plug in on the switch here. This little connector comes off. We've already taken that ground ring off when we pulled the carburetor pieces apart. We can slide this up, that little plug comes out. The last thing is this little clippy on the cooling fin. And it's a little tight, or it can be, but looks like that one came off okay. So that's it. That's all the wiring. So now it's time to get the flywheel off so we can see what we're doing down in that area. So I got a 19mm socket here, and we just snug that in right here. We got our rope in place, so we just do a cycle on the piston. Now the piston is pressing up against the rope, so it can't continue going through its cycle, and off this comes. So we got a nut, we got a thrust washer, now this thing is stuck on here, so I can't get it off. So a trick that I saw on another site was to take a mallet and hit on the end opposite the flywheel to get it to come off. And there we go. Popped right off. No problem. So I like that trick. Works nice. Alright, so the next item we gotta take off is the clutch, which for this saw requires either a spanner wrench or this special little tool, which is, I guess, is a spanner wrench. And the way it works, it just fits into these two holes like that. And then these clutches are all left-handed thread, which means instead of righty-tighty, lefty-loosey, it's righty-loosey, lefty-tighty. So the way to get this bugger off is to, well, it kind of depends. In my case, I had a locked piston, so I didn't need to stop the piston from turning. But if you don't have a locked piston, then you might have to take some rope and shove it down the spark plug hole, and then when the piston comes up, the rope will jam it so it won't be able to come up anymore, and that's a good way to jam the piston without destroying it, and then you can get it back out. And once that's not going to move on you, you take a impact wrench, or probably an impact wrench works the best, and you just zip this thing right off. And remember, righty loosey in this case. And with me, since I had a locked piston, I didn't need to do the piston rope trick. I just got my impact wrench out and twisted this thing right off. So I have it loosened up here, and then it just spins right off. And then there's a whole bunch of parts that come falling off after it, so we got to keep them all in order. And then there's a small bearing here, so that needs to come off. And then last of all, this thrust washer needs to come off. And that keeps this from rubbing against this plastic plate here. So the next thing we need to remove is the bar oiler cover plate. So we'll get in here, make sure not to strip these screws out. And off that pops. That's it. So I guess this is maybe one of the features of the saw that maybe makes it a homeowner's grade type saw. You know, it has a lot of what I think are pretty decent features, like the air injection system, for instance. But one of the things you cannot do is you cannot take the cylinder head off without taking the entire saw apart. You have to pull off, well, you might not have to pull off the flywheel, but you have to pull the clutch side off because, well, for two reasons. One, you have to, the crankcase bolts are underneath, so there's two on this side and two behind you can't see, and you can't get to them from underneath the saw. So you have to undo these four mounting bolts that mount the engine to the casing in order to pull this out, and then once you've done that, you have the clutch side of the crankshaft sticking through the casing, and to get that out you gotta, if the clutch is on, you still can't pull it out, so you have to pull the clutch off in order to get the entire engine out of this saw. A lot of pro level saws, you can access the crankcase bolts from above. There's sometimes reliefs or holes drilled in the cooling fins, so you can get down there with a wrench and get it off from the top. So you don't have to touch the flywheel, you don't have to touch the clutch, and you can pull the whole top end off. The piston will be sitting there and you can work on it or replace it, whatever is needed right there. That added convenience is not a feature of this saw, so I guess that's one of the reasons why this must be considered a homeowner's grade saw. So what we need to do is take our 8mm wrench and take off these mounting bolts on the bottom, and then we can get at it. And voila, comes apart into two pieces, and got the crankcase, which I cleaned up somewhat before putting back together, and then now we have the engine, so we can work on that and dig into this deeper and figure out what's going on. We can get the bottom case bolts off to get to the insides of this thing. Alright, so the last step we need to take to get the piston out and see what's going on is take off the crankcase. So, last few little screws here. Okay, this thing's going to come off. Got our little crankcase right there. We'll put that aside. And then there's no gasket here, so there is a small layer of Permatex that keeps this all sealed, so we'll have to make sure to put that back when we put this thing back together. And this thing should just pop right out, which it does. So this thing had a lot of varnish in it when I first took it apart, and the piston was actually really stuck in there, so even lifting up on the crankshaft here, I couldn't pull it out. So I used some PV Blaster, probably could have used some acetone like I ended up using to clean up all that varnish, or a carburetor cleaner, and it probably would have released that varnish hold. But once I got that all cleaned up and all the varnish out of there, the piston actually slid in and out quite nicely. But this whole assembly just pulls right on out, and so you're just left with the empty jug here. And after cleaning it up with acetone, it looks quite nice, so I don't think I'm going to have a problem reassembling this and running it. I do believe that it was varnish that had caused the piston to stick so hard that I couldn't even pull it out originally. And then here's our little assembly with the piston and the piston ring. Everything rotates nicely. The bearings feel like they're in really good shape, and everything looks reasonably clean, especially now that I cleaned it up. And that's about it. So it did take a little cleaning, and I have cleaned everything else, and so we're ready for reassembly now. Really all it took was some acetone and carburetor cleaner, and it really fixed all my problems, it appears. Alright, so now we are ready for reassembly. So I had taken the piston ring out to clean out the land, or the groove around the piston. The piston ring was actually stuck, and I used a little trick, I think Donnie Boy 73 introduced me to, which was to clamp this in my vise very gently, just to hold it really, and use a very light application of the MAP gas torch just to try to evenly heat up around it, and it ended up popping the ring free. So I was then able to grab it and gently pull it out, and you have to be very careful pulling it out and putting it back in. They're very brittle and can break. So we got the piston ring back in. There's a little dimple in the, I don't know if I can show it very well here, but you have to get that dimple to line up properly with the ends of the piston ring, and it does have an orientation that it needs to be. The ring needs to be in order to match that dimple when the ring closes. So having done that and having that lined up, we're ready to reinsert it back into the cylinder, and the cylinder is clean, as I mentioned. Really just took a wipe and a spray with carburetor cleaner, and really not any wear. I can still see a lot of good cross hatching here. There's no grooves or scrapes of any kind, either on the piston itself or on the cylinder wall. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a couple small zip ties to hold the piston ring closed while I work on inserting it. Actually, I might try it without that, because it seemed to not really need that. But what I do need to do is make sure that the ring is aligned with the dimple, and that the crankshaft is oriented the correct way. So this side's the intake, and the clutch is that way, and the flywheel's this way. So the flywheel part of the crankshaft needs to be going this direction. So I'm going to gently stick the piston down in here and see if it's tapered enough to automatically close the piston ring. Didn't seem to take that much force to do this on this particular saw. I know some saws have multiple rings, and yeah, sure enough, this this went together quite easily, so didn't even need to use the zip tie compression technique. But what I do think I might want to do here is put a dab of silicone around inside where this rubber seal goes, so that we can have a totally good seal all the way around the crankshaft. And before I do that, I'm going to double check and make sure that the piston ring is lined up properly. So I'll pick it up like this, pull it down, twist it slightly, and look inside there, and sure enough the dimple lines up with the ring and it's compressed all the way, so everything seems to have been done correctly there. I needed to take a quick look at this and figure out where the silicone needs to go. So I think that's what we'll do, is we'll do just a little bit of silicone just on the outside of that groove, so we don't get any down inside the crankcase. So I just have some Permatex black silicone. I think this should do the trick. I've used this before on oil pans and such, and it seems to work fine. So we'll get these two mated together. Make sure everything lines up. Looks good. So start inserting the bolts. Good practice with most assemblies like this is to get all your bolts started before tightening down too much on any of them. That way you have a little bit of slop to work with to make sure that all the bolts will be able to be started. And then once you have them started, you can snug them down, and then you're going to want to work in an X pattern to try to get even pressure. So you just go until it kind of starts feeling some pressure, cross to the other opposite corner, snug it down till you feel some pressure, and then just work your way around in an X pattern. And then go back to where you started and give everything a good snug. I don't have a manual for this saw, and even if I did, I don't have a shop manual for it, so just kind of have to do a little bit of this by feel, just realizing these aren't very large fasteners. And it's in aluminum, so we don't want to strip out the aluminum. So that's probably good enough. So then we want to test this thing and make sure it actually spins reasonably well, which it does. So I can spin the crankshaft by hand, which is good. It means there's not very much resistance, which I suppose I should expect since I oiled the cylinder. There's a lot of lubrication in there. Hopefully it should be a little bit tougher than that once the oil is gone off the walls of the cylinder. because we want to make sure the piston ring is getting a good seal against the cylinder wall, which it can only do if there's enough pressure against the wall. So hopefully this thing will have a decent compression by the time it's all put back together and gets run back in. So that silicone's going to take about 24 hours to cure, so that's fine. It's going to take me maybe more than that to even put this all the way back together. So okay, so now that's all sealed up. Should be good to go. Just got to keep junk out of the intake and the exhaust ports and spark plug hole, so we don't have any problems. And we can start building the saw back up again with that. So our next step in reassembly is to put the cylinder back, or the engine I guess, back into the case of the saw. So again, we have our 4 mounting bolts, we have our bar oiler gear right here that needs to interface with the oiler spur gear inside the case. So we just shimmy this through and drop it in place, and everything lines up. We'll give this thing a quick spin to make sure that it's turning, so it's not bound up. It turns. So now we can flip this over and get these bolts inserted here. And again, getting them all started first before tightening any of them to make sure that they all get started. Give ourselves some wiggle room. And again, our trusty 8mm wrench will help us get these things snugged up. I probably could use a screwdriver for this instead, but oh well. I'm just going to flip it upside down so it doesn't try to fall out of place. And again, just snugging these up gently until they're all snug, and then going back through and doing a tightening sequence after. So these are just holding the engine to the case, so they just need to be snug. Again, tightening in an X pattern to make sure that everything tightens square and true. And going through once again, turning the crankshaft, making sure the bar oiler moves with it, which it does. So nothing's bound up. Engine still cycles, which is good. Means we don't have anything bound up. The next thing we need to put on is the bar oiler cover plate. So slip it over the crankshaft, kind of pop it in place, and snug down the screws. So now we're ready to put the clutch back on, so we'll put the thrust washer on first. And this guy, I greased the bearing because I figured I had it off and I should probably grease it. This bearing turns every time the clutch is not engaged. So at idle and whatnot, that bearing is doing a lot of work. Okay, so then we want to be careful not to get any grease on these clutch surfaces or else it won't stick right. And we'll spin it on again, lefty tighty with these clutches. And got my tool here. This doesn't have to be particularly tight because it's going to get tightened up during use, but it's a good idea to kind of try to give it a little bit of snugness, make sure it doesn't go anywhere. Alright, so now we're ready to put the flywheel back on. I ended up doing the rope in the piston to hold it, to tighten up the clutch just a little bit, just because I didn't want it to be finger tight as it was. But it's going to come in handy because we're going to need to do the same thing for the flywheel anyways. So we're going to put the flywheel on here, make sure it's in its groove, and we're going to have to do a cycle on the piston. And then we got a thrust washer and flywheel nut. Again, our trusty 19mm. And with the rope holding the piston in place, we'll be able to snug this down. We want to make this tight, so we don't want to strip out the crankshaft. I don't know what the spec's supposed to be, but it should be pretty tight. That's about all I'm willing to put on it right now. So, and then loosen it up. Pop the rope out. No harm, no foul. Everything's spinning nicely. Check the piston movement again. Everything looks fine. Everything's good. So now we're ready to put the wiring components back on. Now that we have the flywheel back in place. And we're going to get that done. So we mount up the magneto or stator, make sure we get the grounding ring captured with this little screw, socket head screw. And there's a clearance spec that this needs to have. It's actually too tight right now because it's hitting the flywheel. So we're going to need to push it up a little bit, but we don't want to push it too far or else the pickup won't get the signal from the magnets. So we want to make sure it spins freely. And we need to take a close look at it, and I think it's a couple millimeters. So we just want to make sure that pickup is only a couple millimeters off and kind of eyeball it here. Maybe we'll get it a little closer. Oh, that's what happens. It wants to stick to it. So we'll have to just snug it up and then run it. So if we don't get a good spark, then we can play with this a little more and try to get it so it gets a better signal. But that is a couple millimeters, so it should be close enough, at least to get the saw running. And so then we finish up by putting this little plug in and plugging in our little switch wiring here. And we'll do that ground lug when we do the carburetor. We got this ground lug captured, and then we just have to slide this little clip-on that holds the spark plug lead. Well, now we're ready to put the muffler assembly back on. Doesn't really matter at what point in the process you do this. I just decided to do it now. Start filling some of the holes that are open, keep the crankcase open to the surroundings. So the first piece to go in is this little guy. I don't really know what it's for, but it goes inside the exhaust port here and sits flush with that. Then there's this heat shield. It's labeled which side is the muffler side, so that only goes on one way. And then the first half of the can, there's actually a gasket on the back side, which I'm just reusing. So didn't want to buy a rebuild kit for any of this. And then the little screw inside there. What we're going to have to do here is we're going to have to get this thing started and snugged, but we're going to have to put the other half on, or at least look real close and line up the other two holes so that when we put the other half of the assembly on, the holes all line up the way they're supposed to. So we'll just get this thing started. I guess I need a new ratchet. This thing doesn't work all that great. And we'll just check and make sure the holes are all lined up. And the screws on this capture the muffler guard, or the screen. They go right through the middle. So we'll just put this all on as an assembly. And hopefully everything lines up and we don't have to take it apart again. And then this kind of pops together. And you can tighten her up. And there is that graphite gasket, so we need to give this a little bit of snug so we don't have any exhaust leaks. It really shouldn't take too much pressure to do this. This is just thin sheet metal, so we don't want to deform it. That's it. Alright, now we're ready to start plugging up more holes to the cylinder. Maybe start with the spark plug, just to fill that hole so nothing can fall in there. We don't need to do anything else with that hole, so put that on. I guess we'll give it a good snug now. Got a scratch. Pop the lead on just so it's all ready to go. I can take it off and check it again before I try to start up the saw. But if I forget to do that, I can just go with what I have here. So we're going to take this adapter for the intake, kind of twist it around to get it down in here, and then get it lined up with the intake boss on the cylinder casting, and pop it on. Make sure the holes line up, make sure the wiring is captured. We can plug our power or our on-off switch wire in now, and then we put our two little bolts in and tighten them down. And there's a gasket on this side that's going to mate up to the carburetor. These are all 4mm Allen heads, by the way. Well, now we're ready, I think, to put the two halves of the saw back together, start making it look like a chainsaw again. It doesn't really matter, I suppose, what order you do all this in, but I just thought now is a pretty good time to do this. We can stick the fuel line up and into this area before we put the carburetor back on. The carburetor is going to be in the way, if we put it on first. So what we do is we have to stick these two halves together and get the rubber isolators inside. And we can start with this chain guard screw. Let me turn the saw a little bit so maybe you can see. So this chain guard screw goes into one of these rubber bumpers, and it's clocked so you can only turn it, or it has a square hole it sits in, so you can only turn it in 90-degree increments, but we know which way it has to go. So, and then we'll feed the fuel line up through the hole into the intake area and make sure it has a little bit of tension on it so that it doesn't pinch, and then just kind of rotate the saw down onto the other bumpers and kind of give this a slight tug so we know it's not pinched. Maybe even take a look-see in there and push it back and forth. And it is pinched, so I gotta fix that. Okay. Yeah, now it can move freely. So we have to watch out for that. And then the next piece I want to put on to kind of hold that in place is this little trim piece, a little cover. Just kind of pops on here, and with an Allen head it gets snugged up. If you can get everything to line up right. Okay, so the rest of them we're going to have to wait till we get the recoil on and a couple other things, which are only a couple steps away, so no big deal there. Have a little bit of extra fuel line here, but it can move back and forth between the fuel tank and this area. I think it's about in the right spot to reach its way over to the carburetor. He kind of has to circle around. I think it even has to go under these wires. I'll have to kind of see once I get the adjustment, the carburetor and the adjustment screws in here, but I think it actually goes maybe behind here and goes up and around. Alright, so I'm ready to start putting the handle back on. Start wanting to hold this saw the way it is intended to be held and just have a better place to grab onto it. So just need to insert it back on and get everything lined up the right way. Oh yeah, that's nice. Nice to be able to grab it by the handle. And two on the bottom. Alright, now it's a little easier to manipulate. Alright, well now we're ready to put the carburetor back on. So I'm going to pick it up, make sure that it's clean. this thing worked fine, and there goes my throttle lever. This thing worked fine when I pulled it apart from the piston being seized, so I don't expect that the throttle needs any, or the carburetor needs anything, but it's probably good practice every so often to clean it up. And if it's running funny, throw a carb rebuild kit on it. It just replaces a couple of gaskets and diaphragms that kind of get worn out. So to get this in here, we'll just kind of put our throttle in place and our choke lever in place. Our fuel line, I'm going to try running it on this side. I know there's a plate that goes over here, but we'll see how it does running on this side. And then you kind of have to wiggle it into position. And sometimes these studs can kind of help get everything lined up. So they'll find the holes that they have to go into. That can sometimes help. I think we're in a pretty good spot here. You can kind of feel there's a couple detents that the carburetor sits in, so you can kind of feel that it's sitting in there and not wanting to move around at all. So this throttle lever is kind of in the way of this, so I'll just pull it up a little bit, and now we have better access to the other stud. And just give that a snug. We want to make sure we compress the gasket so there's no air leaks. Air leaks will really throw your tuning off. What's going on here? And pop the fuel line on. And you'll see the choke and throttle linkage is going where it needs to go. It's plugged in. So we're ready for the next step. Alright, well now I'm ready to add the air injection mechanism back on, this fancy little blue dealio. And it kind of just goes on from this end, and then you have to make sure it lines up with this little plastic adapter plate. So you kind of slide it on. It provides a seal, an air seal around the whole airbox area. Keep all that dust out of there. Keep your air filter a little bit cleaner, I guess. And then you just kind of help it along all the way down. And for this guy, small screwdriver works because there's like a little tab that has to find a hole to slide into here. And then the last one pops on, and that's all it takes. And pull the flywheel. This is going to get held in place by the recoil assembly, but kind of just make sure as it sits it's not in the way of anything. Alright, so now we're getting close. I just got to put my air filter adapter on. So just slips over the carburetor studs, 2 studs there, snaps down, nothing else in the area, so just make sure it seats all the way. And then you thread your 2 little 10mm nuts on. And give them a little snug. Last is my air filter, so plop that in place. I might have to get into this again when I start the saw up and get it tuned. You actually want to tune it with the air filter off normally. But I'll put it on here now so I know I don't have any extra parts after I'm all done with this thing. Alright, to get the covers back on, I'll start with the recoil. So, got to put this guy on first. He just pops right in there. Make sure that those two holes line up with this little blue piece so it holds it in place. Maybe give the flywheel one final spin, make sure it doesn't hit anything. It's all good. And then take your recoil cover, put it back on. This screw and this screw are for the plastic, and this screw and this screw are for the metal threads that are part of the rubber bumper assembly and hold the two halves of the saw together. So we take our scrunch, okay. Top plate, top cover. Again, the scrunch works pretty well for this. So we'll should just pop in place without too much trouble. One more on this side. And we are ready to put the bar back on. So we're basically at the last step before we can run this guy again. It's time to put the bar and the chain back on. We'll have to do a little sharpening on this chain before we run it too much, but I want to get it on there for balance and everything else. So we got to make sure it's running the right direction. And slip it over the clutch. Start laying it over the bar. And then pull it out the bar to start tightening the chain a little bit. Make sure everything's starting to line up the way it's supposed to. Get our chain brake cover. It's got a little tab on the back we have to line up. And then might have to loosen the adjusting nut a little bit, which means you turn it in just a tad so that it'll line up with the hole in the bar. You'll little more. Maybe the other way. There we go. So once you're satisfied that that is on square, and we get our bar nuts. It's a good idea to have a couple of these as spares, especially if you're going out in the woods for the day. If you end up having to take the chain off, put a new chain on or whatever, you might drop one of these, and then it's just good to have a spare around. So before we tighten these down, we want to tighten the chain up. So we turn this in, and I think I tightened them a little too much. Turn the chain adjuster in. You see what I'm doing there? It's just that screw on the side, on the front. And we want to just pull that chain up. You want to be able to pull down on it and reveal a couple links, maybe 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, that you can get totally free with just moderate pressure. And you want to double check and make sure that this will slide. So it's feeling pretty good. And then when you tighten this up, you want to hold it by the handle and push the tip of the bar down to kind of simulate the forces that are going to be acting on the bar when you're actually cutting. At that point, you can tighten these bar nuts down. And just check everything, make sure it's all good the way you want it before you run it. Alright, so at this point we have pulled the whole saw apart. We've got the piston loosened up. It seemed that it was varnish that was keeping it stuck. And if I turn this around, I pull on the pull cord. It has pretty decent compression. It feels like it's not much different than it was when I last ran the saw. So I'm hopeful that this has fixed our little problem. So I'll go get some fresh gas and mix it up and give it a try. I guess I'll get a video of it running and we'll see if we're successful in getting this thing. At least I can pull the pull cord now, which is a lot more than I could do a month or so ago. So in the meantime, I got to learn a little bit about the saw myself. Hopefully this video is helpful for anyone else with these. Husqvarna 36 and 41 I imagine are pretty similar, as well as maybe even the 136 and the 141. I don't know how many design changes there were, but this is a 1997 saw. But it's done pretty good for me here in my little homestead, so just like to keep it going. Thanks for watching.